Paige Wilson.
And I'm Ashley Ostrowski.
This is Chronicles of the Muse, where we cherish the meaningful and absurd stories that shape our culture. Hello everyone. This podcast episode is going to be covering The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. This book is a bit intimidating at first, to say the least. I remember taking it with Dr. Messer in his 20th Century American novel class, and unlike most of the people in the class who really felt like it was one of the worst things that happened to them that year, I really enjoyed it. It was a bit of an adventure. What do you think, Ashley?
I really liked it too. I think it was my American Lit class, and Dr. Messer had alluded to it, and we were going to read it, and I heard it was going to be one of the hardest books that I'd ever read in an English class, but it ended up not being that bad. I ended up really loving it at the end.
Yeah, it's nice to hear we're on the same page here. It's a roller coaster of a read, and it's not for everyone, but I'm sure that some of our listeners will enjoy it if they're willing to give it a chance. So, Ashley, you were going to go into a little bit of background about this. Do you want to get us started here?
Sure. Sound and the Fury was published in 1929 by William Faulkner. He described his own book as a real son of a bitch, the greatest I'll ever write. Now, I'd say that most students would agree with that, at least the first part. It's a challenging book to read at first, just because of the narration, but the plot isn't super complicated. The action is centered around the fictional Compson family in Yakima County, where most of Faulkner's writings are set. Faulkner has this whole world of different characters that he brings together, and they're all kind of intertwined. And this was my first introduction to Faulkner's fictional universe.
Yeah, it definitely was my first introduction as well. I haven't read any of his other books yet. I hope to, definitely. But as of yet, I haven't had the time to really delve into his whole universe. And I've heard he's pretty consistent across the different books, so he really did a lot of world crafting.
So, I guess one of the first questions is, what makes this novel so difficult to read? Clearly, it was hyped up as a really difficult book to read, and it is. It has 4 different characters' points of view. The first one is Benji, who has a severe intellectual disability.
Yeah, it makes it very difficult to read. Everything that he says he doesn't filter it through his thoughts. It's all sensory perception. None of it's filtered to the point where he's actually reflecting on what he's doing. So it's kind of hard to understand that way. I would definitely say that, for example, I can give you a quote here. I ran into the box, but when I climbed onto it, it jumped away and hit me on the back of the head, and my throat made a sound. And you can kind of hear from saying that he's not seeing things as most people see them. Like, he's personifying the objects that are around him. He's even personifying his own throat, which I don't know if that counts as personifying necessarily, but his throat made a sound. It's not like he cried out or something like that. His throat made a sound, and the box jumped away from him. He sees things very differently. And I would say another thing would be his notion of time is part of the problem. Would you say the same thing, Ashley?
Yeah, he kind of jumps from the past to the present. Faulkner likes to use italics a lot, so that can kind of be confusing at first. But there are a little bit of keys that kind of give you a better notion of how it is. They give you a better notion of where we are. For example, Benji is taken care of by 3 different people in the story. Benji is cared for by Versh when he's in his early childhood, so that's when he's really young. And then we see he's with TP when he's in his middle teens, and then way later he's taken care of by Luster. The story actually starts out with Luster, so Benji is actually the oldest at the beginning of the story, which is kind of interesting.
It's kind of interesting. I always think of him whenever he's in his child years, because that was the most evocative to me whenever he was talking about his time with Caddy. But before we go any further, I think it might be helpful to our listeners if we just went over some of the characters a little bit here. We started with Benji here. Benji is a character with a serious mental illness. He has a severe intellectual disability that affects the way he perceives things. He's very kind-hearted. He's a good character, well-rounded, but he's the first character that's introduced. But there's some other characters that we want to discuss as well.
Yeah, so Benji is one of the brothers in the Compson family. His other brother is Quentin. Quentin's the older brother. He's sent off to Harvard because his family sees him as pretty promising. And he's kind of has his own difficulties with narration too. He's not really in a good place after college, and he's kind of trying to figure out things and with his family. It's definitely not an easy jump from Benji to Quentin.
No, I felt like it actually got harder with Quentin in some ways. I feel like the hard part about Benji's section was that we started with it and it took a while to get used to, but Quentin's section is just hard in a completely different way. It's so didactic and dense, but it's not bad. It's enjoyable to read. It just takes more attention than even some of the other sections of the book. And I think we should talk about Caddy as well. She in some ways seems like the main character of this book because everything is centered around actions that she did. The brothers are all obsessed with her. And why do you think that is?
It seems like Caddy's just sort of like the central female figure in the novel. Benji's really attached to her because she's sort of almost like a mother figure to her. We'll kind of get into that more later, but also yeah, Quentin seems pretty attached, so.
I would say. And Caddy's also somewhat of a rebellious figure in the book against the norms of her time. She's very interesting in that way, so even though she doesn't get a section to herself, she still feels like one of the pivotal characters of the book, so we'll keep revisiting her. The other one is Jason, and he's a piece of work.
He's a jerk. I mean, on the bright side, his section is easy to read in one way, but in another way, he's so self-centered and rude. It's kind of hard to get through a section.
Yeah, I don't think anyone could call him a likable character. He's not going to be anyone's favorite.
But speaking of likable characters, there is Dilsey's section at the end. Dilsey, who's their maid, she gets a section to herself at the end, and we kind of get to see her perception of everything that's going on.
Yeah, her section is so much more positive and uplifting, and I would say she's the moral center of the book. She's really important to the development of the other characters, even though some of them would not be willing to admit it. And she's really important to what's going on there. And even though it's not narrated directly from her point of view, as in you can see her thoughts, you still get to see all of her actions and how good of a person she is. And I feel like it's a fitting way to end the book.
Yeah, I feel like if the Dilsey section wasn't in the book, it wouldn't be nearly as powerful and good as it is. It kind of feels hopeless otherwise.
Yeah, I think it would be completely hopeless without her section, because this is really a book about the downfall of the Compson family.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the parents they are technically like present in the novel, but they're not really emotionally there. Their father is an alcoholic, and then the mother is a hypochondriac, and she's not really the best mother. I'll just start with that.
I feel like that's an understatement, but we'll talk about that later. I think the next thing we would be interested in talking about here would be Faulkner's style, because he has a pretty unique style. You talked about already how he has italics to show from past to present. He initially wanted to print this book with multiple different colors of ink because he wanted to make it less confusing for readers. But publishers at the time weren't really willing to go with that request because it would have been expensive and it would have been complicated and outside the norm as well.
I think that would be very cool. I've heard that there's a copy out there that's like that, and that would be so cool to be able to check out and read.
I did hear that as well. I looked into it a little bit myself. It looked really interesting, but it didn't look like it was for sale, like you could get a copy anymore. And if you could get a copy of like that anymore, it would probably be really expensive.
Another thing that makes them kind of confusing is, I don't know if we've talked about this, but stream of consciousness, that's a big part of at least the first two sections. I guess they all are stream of consciousness, but Faulkner doesn't use complete sentences. Sometimes they're just not finished. And then quotation marks aren't there. So you kind of just have to guess when someone's speaking. And then same with apostrophes and contractions.
Yeah, I think the quotation marks are there sometimes, but sometimes they're not. That's what makes it really confusing. But also, his questions are not ended in question marks, which is really interesting because it makes all of them seem so assertive and like they're almost not asked as questions. Like the way people are communicating, they're not really listening to each other, it almost feels like, because they're not even really asking questions. They're asserting them as a statement, because they're not using that question mark at the end. That's the way it came across to me.
No, that's really cool.
I think we already kind of talked about the difference between the various perspectives and levels of awareness for the characters, but we definitely would say Benji's the least aware of himself. He doesn't have that filter. Quentin is ultra aware of himself, but has so many problems he's caught up in that he kind of loses sight of himself. And the one that seems really like a solid character that really knows where she stands is Dilsey. Did you want to talk about any of the other perspectives here?
Yeah, I mean, Dilsey is very, very good. I feel like Jason kind of is just so stuck in his own head that he doesn't even think about what other people are thinking. I mean, you had a kind of good point earlier that, like, no one really thinks about what others are thinking, and they're all very self-involved in a way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
It's kind of what makes it a tragedy, but
yeah, because none of them are willing to really get outside their heads. They're so stuck in their own heads. Even though, whenever I said earlier that Quentin is super aware, he's super aware of his own self and his place in the world and how things are not exactly how he wants them to be, and it frustrates him. But he's not super aware of the good things in the world and what makes life worth living and things like that. He's not really aware of.
no. And I also find it interesting that, like, Caddy's character, she's only ever described through other characters. So, like, everyone's really attached to her, but we don't really get to know her. And I feel like that kind of shows some of the lack of true knowledge of each other or emotional intimacy, I guess. No one really, like, talks to each other. They kind of just see each other through this romanticized or, like, hateful lens.
Yeah, exactly.
So, speaking of characters, who would you say is the worst character?
Yeah, it's a toss-up. It's between Jason and Mrs. Compson. They're both awful. I know the whole class, you were in this class with me, but the whole class pretty much agreed that Mrs. Compson was one of the worst mothers in literature. For example, she wore mourning black after she found out that her daughter was kissed by a guy. Like, can you imagine if your mother wore mourning black after your first kiss? Like, that kind of puts a damper on things.
And since it's the holiday season, I'll give you a lovely quote by her. Nobody knows how I dread Christmas. Nobody knows. I'm not one of those women who can stand things. I wish for Jason's and the children's sake I was stronger.
Nice. That's so her.
I know just Christmas is tough because there's all like the stress and gifts and all that stuff, but she doesn't care about her family very much. I don't know.
I'll give you another quote. This one's great because it just shows how completely aggravating she is and how completely unaware of she is of how aggravating she is. She said, "I know I'm nothing but a burden to you, but I'll be gone soon. Then you'll be rid of my bothering." Like, honestly, like, that seems kind of passive-aggressive, almost.
Yeah, it's kind of manipulative because she just isolates herself from them.
Yeah, and I don't think we talked about this yet, but she is a hypochondriac. She is always believing she's sick, but from what we can tell, she's not actually as sick as she seems to let on. She's capable of doing things. She just won't do that. She's always ordering Dilsey around and the other characters that are the servants at their house, and she doesn't want to do anything, and she doesn't act as a real mother to Benji, but she gets mad at Caddy when Caddy acts like a mother to Benji. It's really horrible.
She's awful. I'd also say that her husband's pretty terrible too, because he's kind of a nihilist, and he kind of messes with Quentin in a way. Like, I remember he was telling him that nothing in life matters. He kind of just has given up, which, I mean, Mrs. Compson has given up too, but I don't know who's worse in that way, because I feel like she just kind of abandons them. At least he's, like, honest about what he believes. I don't know. Like, she's kind of like, I'm just gonna avoid the children, but he at least is acknowledging that he, like, just feels empty inside. At least he's not trying.
Yeah, at least he's honest.
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of a low bar, but there has to be a low bar for some of these characters, otherwise they'd never make it over it. But yeah, he's an alcoholic. He's not really there for them. You get some sections that are about him, but you don't hear too much about him compared to other characters that come in more often. You mostly get it from a section where he's just talking to Quentin about how hopeless life is. And it's depressing.
Yeah, it's some great father-son talks there, honestly. I'm not really surprised that Jason's as messed up as he is, or Quentin.
Yeah, I'm not surprised about that either. And speaking of Jason, Jason's the other one he is bad. He's racist, he's sadistic, he's sexist, he's xenophobic, he's anti-Semitic.
He pretty much makes a mean comment about every single person that he meets. Like, I can't think of him ever saying anything nice to anyone.
And if they are a woman, oh my gosh, he's even worse.
He's terrible to Caddy. And then Caddy actually has a daughter, which is revealed later on.
Yeah, Quentin is treated terribly by him. She's supposed to get this allowance from her mother every so often, and either Jason takes it completely, or if he finds out that she heard about it, he'll give her a little money out of it. But like a tiny percentage of the money out of it. He's a jerk. His first line that we get out of the whole book is once a bitch, always a bitch, what I say. And I think that pretty much sums him up as a character.
His sexism is just disturbing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, he doesn't really seem to, although his family's pretty terrible, he doesn't really acknowledge anything. The main trouble, the main trauma of his life is that Caddy had gotten engaged and Jason is supposed to get a job through this fiance, but then Jason's supposed to get this job at the bank. Jason was really hoping for this job at the bank, but then the arrangement fell through, and Jason was just furious. He's like, this is why I hate Caddy and everything like that. When it really wasn't Caddy's fault at all.
No, it wasn't. But he definitely blames her.
Jason hates Caddy's daughter because he hates Caddy.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense the way he treats people. I mean, personally, I think Mrs. Compson's worse, but I wouldn't like to meet Jason either.
No, me neither. I'd say Mrs. Compson's probably worse.
Yeah.
So let's kind of dive into the themes a little bit. Like, I know a major scene in the novel is when Caddy's not allowed to climb a tree because of her father. He says that she can't climb this tree, and then she decides to anyway. And it kind of parallels the biblical Adam and Eve story in Genesis because she ends up seeing a snake in the tree. Isn't that right?
A snake comes out from underneath the porch when she climbs the tree, which highlights that Genesis story. I think a lot of people wouldn't recognize that unless they were more familiar with biblical stories, but Faulkner would have been very familiar with biblical stories, so I definitely would say this is an intentional choice on his part.
And it kind of has to do with, like, it's almost like a loss of innocence, but it actually isn't.
Yeah, she didn't really lose her innocence, but it's the beginning of Caddy's fall almost. She learns about death. That's why she's crawling up the tree to look through the window. She learns about one of the characters' death, and it's not like death is a new concept to her, but seeing a funeral and a dead body is completely different than hearing about how people die. So I guess it wouldn't be exactly her fall, but it's some of her loss of the innocent childhood where death was a far off thing.
Yeah, like, for example, they talk a lot about Caddy's muddy drawers. It's a major description in the novel. And it's interesting how her muddy drawers actually don't, like, symbolize that she's been tarnished or, like, she's dirty in any way. Our teacher actually made the distinction between it, earthy and dirty. Earthy is a word that's, like, healthy, natural, and dirty is more in the terms of corruption, as we've heard.
Yeah, that made a lot of sense to me. And I know Dr. Messer he really made this point. He went over it several times because it was really important. It was it was kind of funny to hear how much a bunch of college students talked about someone's muddy drawers, but but I think it was important. There's also the theme of parenthood. I feel like that's super critical to this novel. There's a quote from Quentin inside his section where he said, "If I just had a mother so I could say mother, mother." He doesn't really have a mother who's emotionally there for him.
No, I mean, I feel like this was one of like the lines that really tugged at my heart. He just doesn't have anyone, and that's it's kind of easy to be like, well, he's got all these problems, what's going on? And then you kind of just feel like, oh, wow, he really is kind of alone.
Yeah. And I feel like going to college just furthered that aloneness for him. I feel like his parents weren't there emotionally, but they weren't there physically when he was at college either, and he lost a lot of the fantasies that he had about what the past was like. And Mr. Compson, he wasn't an adequate father figure either. He could not really sate his children's emotional needs because he's so hopeless himself. He's just lost in his own depression.
Yeah, he doesn't even really try to support them at all. Although they do the odd thing is they do support Quentin financially because they put all this money into allowing him to go to Harvard. It's like they care more about the family name than they do like their actual children and their well-being.
Yeah, that's part of the tragedy of the book. Now, I know neither of us are psychologists or super well versed in all mental illnesses at least, but I do think we should talk about how Faulkner portrayed mental illness a little bit.
Well, I know like for Benji, we're aware that he has an intellectual disability. We know this because he's being cared for by other people and just the way people talk about him, and also just his way of perception is different than other people's. But we don't really know what he has, or we don't know much about the details of it. But we also don't know how accurate it was portrayed just because it isn't named and we're not psychologists and we don't have that knowledge. But I would say that he portrayed him with a lot of sympathy. Like he Benji is human. He's got a lot of lovable characteristics. And I think he's just as much, if not more of a, he's just as much of a victim as all the other children. And I really feel sad for Benji just for that, for all of it.
Yeah, it's a sad story. It's really this book is a tragedy. Another question that was pretty hot topic in our class was, did Quentin commit incest?
Yeah, Quentin likes to talk a lot about incest, which pretty uncomfortable at first, but as we kind of talked about it in class, it doesn't seem like something Quentin actually did, but he does tell his father that he committed incest with Caddy because he kind of Quentin wants something in life to matter. Like he holds on to this Southern code of morality, which he connects with like his grandfathers and the past Compson family. Because the Compson family right now doesn't really have that code, but Quentin really thinks that the past was better and that there's some sort of good moral code to hold on to. So he thinks that somehow his father doesn't care about Caddy's behavior, he doesn't care about anyone else's. So it seems like he really wants his father to be shocked. So that's why he tells his nihilistic father, something has to matter. So I committed incest with my sister, hoping it will work. But does it?
It doesn't seem to do anything to his father. His father's like, no, nope, you didn't. And Quentin's like, but I did, Daddy. But no, yeah, not exactly. That's not a quote from the book, but basically that's what happened. And
Quentin is not very convincing.
no, and if anything, maybe Quentin would do that. Maybe he does seem weirdly obsessed with his sister, but I think higher of Caddy than this. I don't think Caddy would commit incest.
No, Caddy does not seem any way interested. No. More Quentin. Quentin also has another thing. He's very obsessed with clocks and times. Like I said before, he's kind of obsessed with chivalry in the past, and he thinks it's a better time for the family. And that's kind of why he's obsessed with clocks, because they represent change and time and how things keep going on, even though he doesn't really want to move forward.
Yeah, he is not good at moving forward. He is stuck in the past. And even his near the beginning of his section, Quentin just breaks his watch. Just breaks it. He breaks the glass, he rips the handles off, and it bothers him that it's still ticking. It kind of reminds me of the Telltale Heart with the ticking watch that's in there. It's just he's obsessed with it. He kind of seems to equate mechanical time, like the measurement of time, with time itself.
Yeah, he wants to escape it, which I don't know. Another thing is like that whole day that he just spends wandering around town. He's just trying to like avoid the fact that time exists. I'm pretty sure he skips his class. He just kind of gives up on, tries to escape it, but he learns that he really can't.
Yeah, well, he kind of does at the end of his section. We don't really hear about what happened, but he commits suicide, and I guess he thought that was the only way he could escape time, but it was very tragic, and he's one of my favorite characters, so I was sad to see him go.
Yeah, that's probably one of the great tragedies of the novel. I was really sad.
I would say that he's never really gone because, for one thing, Caddy names her daughter after Quentin, so we're always seeing this name again. But at the same time, he's alluded to so many times after that. He doesn't feel like he's completely disappeared off the face of the earth, like he seemed to have planned. But I do miss him whenever he's gone because I felt like his section was very interesting and it was allowed us to have a great deal of sympathy for him. But speaking of the suicide, we also wanted to talk about why Quentin's suicide was not depicted in the novel. Why did you feel like that was?
I mean, I feel like kind of a point of getting into Quentin's point of view is like we already see that he's suicidal. He's not like in a good place emotionally. It doesn't seem, and then I think it's tough. I don't think it would have added anything to the novel. And also showing suicide is very graphic. It's a lot to depict, and I don't think it would have really added anything. And I think maybe Faulkner would have been the same way. I haven't done a lot of research on it, but I was thinking maybe he wanted to just be careful about how he depicted it. Also, he could have wanted to kind of keep it through other characters. It seems like everything's kind of jumping from perspective to perspective, and that's another kind of loss of the novel. Like we kind of just have to see him. We just kind of have to hear that he ended his life, and it's kind of just doesn't seem like the family cares a lot, or there's not a lot of. Like it's almost just like another thing of their family, which is terrible. I feel like that's kind of how they are, though.
Yeah, I think that basically sums it up. I had some similar thoughts. I was thinking it really didn't add much as well because you already knew that he was going to commit suicide. If you were paying attention, there's all these warning signs. And yeah, I would definitely say it wasn't something that he needed to include. What we also were thinking about was why Benji was renamed because I know that made it confusing for the novel because sometimes they're saying Mari, sometimes they're saying Benji. It's just confusing.
Yeah, I know. They originally named Benji after their uncle Mari, like sort of as a family legacy type of thing. But once they found out he had an intellectual disability, I guess they didn't want to associate him with the family name, so they named him Benji instead, which is really kind of sad.
It's sad and horrible. Like I can't imagine for a child, like even for my little sisters who just changed their name without them having any input on it, and that would be confusing for a child and also just just wrong.
Yeah, I mean, they originally were going to honor the family, and then they just didn't. They just gave up. It's the Compsons are just horrible people.
Most of them are pretty bad. Like, Caddy's pretty good, but it's hard to have sympathy with a lot of them. At least
the parents.
The parents, yeah. And Jason. I have no sympathy for Jason at all.
No, me neither. I do have a lot of sympathy for Benji, though. I mean, in addition to that, there's a point where he gets castrated in the novel.
That never should have happened. It was awful. It was whenever Jason left the gate open. I'm sure he did that on purpose. He knew Benji could get out and cause problems, and he just basically sees these young women and starts following them, and they think that he's going to rape them. So it causes this big scene, and then they castrate him. Like, there's no evidence that he was going to rape them. Like, just because he has an intellectual disability, you're just going to assume that he's going to rape somebody? Like, that's pretty awful.
It's messed up. There was no evidence, and it was Jason's fault that he even leaves in the first place. And it's...
Yeah. It definitely doesn't garner any sympathy for Jason. Jason is awful.
The family they castrate their own child, and then they sell his pasture.
Yeah, there was this pasture that was so important to Benji. Benji would always go out and play in it and spend time there, and they just sell it. And I know they're trying to sell it so that Quentin could go to Harvard, but you can't really sacrifice one child for another.
No, and I feel like they didn't even really care. Like, they didn't want him to, like, get a good education, or they wanted him to be successful, I suppose, but it was all just to restore the family name, to, like, so that they could say he's at this fancy school, Harvard, and that, like, he's being so successful. But Quentin going to Harvard was probably one of the worst things for Quentin, because it just makes him more isolated from everyone else, and he doesn't really grow or improve there.
College doesn't do any good for him, really. He calls it a fine dead sound.
Yeah, and, like, Quentin's aware that they sold Benji's pasture, and, like, Quentin actually, I think, does care for Benji in that way. Like, he knew how important it was to him.
I would say Quentin definitely cares for Benji. He is not happy about the fact that the pasture was sold for him to go to Harvard. He doesn't get anything out of Harvard. It's just not worth it. And then Benji, instead of going to the pasture, they go to other places, such as the golf course, and he acts up there, and nobody seems to understand why. But as readers, we can understand why if we're paying attention. It's because the golfers, they keep yelling caddy, because they're yelling for their caddy. So basically, Caddy leaves her daughter Quentin with her family. It's just there's so much going on at that time, and she ends up leaving her daughter to give her daughter a better life. And after that, while Mrs. Compson is raising this daughter Quentin, she raises her on the condition that Caddy's name is never allowed to be spoken in the house, which is also really horrible. But it makes sense why Benji would get all excited and act up at the golf course, because he's hearing the name Caddy, which he's not allowed to hear at home. The name of his beloved sister, who he's never allowed to see anymore, who was basically his surrogate mother. And, like, did they really expect him not to have any emotion?
Yeah, I mean, what else is he gonna do?
It's just so frustrating. I believe the last thing that we were going to talk about here was, how does this novel handle race?
I feel like it is kind of a complicated question. They do have African American servants in the house, and unfortunately the N-word is used by characters in the novel.
Especially Jason.
Yeah.
The last section in the book, though, that focuses on Dilsey, she's the African-American servant of the Compson household. She's actually portrayed as the most morally grounded and admirable character in the whole book. So I feel like that helps somewhat, but yeah, I wish it didn't use the N-word.
Yeah, I'd agree. The language, it's really unfortunate, but I do really like Dilsey's character. She's probably one of my favorite characters. She's she's definitely the best character
In terms of morals, definitely.
in terms of morals, in terms of caring about other people. She seems to have a healthy relationship with time, with she has to kind of put up with a lot from the family, especially Jason and Quentin too a little bit.
Well, Ashley, did you have any concluding thoughts on the novel?
I just wanted to say it was a really great novel. I hope that this was able to help you understand this more if you're reading it right now, if you have any interest in reading it. It's kind of tough at first, but so worth it, I would say.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's worth it. It's one of my favorite books. It's a tough one, but if you are willing to put in the time, and you will have to put in the time for this one, then it is definitely worth it.
Well, I hope you like this kind of overview of The Sound and the Fury. I'm hoping that we can make more in the future. Maybe talk about some more classics. We could even go back into more Faulkner's Yakima County.
Yeah, definitely we should do that sometime in the future. You can expect more reviews from us and more analysis. You can expect a lot of that sort of thing from this podcast. So I hope you enjoyed and have a good rest of your day.